So today I'm doing a painting called Witch's Dreams, Electrify the Ground. The idea here is witches, of course, interesting, popular character in many different cultures and histories. And I was thinking about how the witch is often identified as sort of an earth mother or connected to the forces of the world. And so I wanted to play with that a little bit. And the idea that her dreams, sort of what makes up the substance of her subconscious, electrifies the earth itself or has some special dynamic connection to the growing forces of the world. So that's my poetry. And I'm going to go right into the detail of the image as we build it up from sketch to final painting. So I prepared the painting isometrically. On Procreate, I sort of set it up in such a way that I'm just above the figure and looking down as she is lying back into a grassy area. It's not just grass, it's full of all kinds of little plants that I was inventing as well, as I was thinking about that theme of the witch and her dreams electrifying the ground and kind of enjoying the verbiage that I'm using there. How does that impact how I'm going to describe the growth? Is it going to be strange and gnarled in the way that the growth after Chernobyl is? Is it going to be sort of impacted by some mysterious external force? Is it going to be fantastical, like the Lorax or something like that, like a completely different world that has its own greenery? And that's what I was going for here. So as I'm developing the face of the character, I'm thinking about her age. I'm thinking about how she's being sort of described as a woman. Often witches are seen outside of sort of acceptable womanhood. So how loose and wild is this? How prim and proper is this? Is there a time? Is this contemporary? Is this medieval? What sort of temporal qualities does this have? At this point, you can see that I did a radical transformation to the face, where I shifted everything back into that sort of isometric view. Things are going up and things are going down. Creates a greater sense of three-dimensionality just through line. And I'm playing at that with the hair too. I'm really shifting it in terms of liquefying it, distorting it, so that I can play back into it with the drawing, which you'll see as I move forward. So I'm figuring out her costuming at this point, as well as the hand and how it's placed against the ground. Does it also have that sense of sort of bending, which you can see I just did there? The bending, the articulation of the fingers. When she is electrifying the ground in the way that she is, when she's having this dynamic connection with the earth, is it hard? Is it under some kind of sort of wild degree of gravity? Is it very light, where it's just a slight touch? And so some of those weights are a big consideration. How is she interacting through her physicality? So you can see that I'm playing through some of those flowers, figuring out how they're sort of opening to the sky. Some of them are cuter, some of them are a little more violent looking, some of them are more symbolic, like sun looking. Some of them have kind of an artificial, like carnival look, as you might see in like Willy Wonka or Alice in Wonderland, sort of a wild whimsy to them. And then I'm also figuring out some of these additional symbols that I'm using within the figure itself. So when it's a witch, is this a witch within the Christian tradition? Is it just a pagan witch who's divorced from any of those concerns? Kind of an earth spirit. So I played with that star there at first on her palm. It changes as I'm moving through. And I'm really trying to define the space now in terms of how she is being enclosed by the greenery. Right? As I'm finding her weight and the way that she's sort of rolling along the ground, how do these little creatures grow around her? How do they enclose her? How do they define her as sort of a secondary mass? It's a little bit like Gulliver's Travels, where you have all those little characters running along or running around Gulliver as this giant who's just landed on the shore. With the clothing, I'm trying to keep things really sort of shape consistent. So you see all the warping and curving that's happened in the hair and in the face, and I'm doing that into the clothing as well. I decided to just go for it and do a pentagram on her palm, and developed it from there. You can see those little dots that I put on her left shoulder, the idea being that she's kind of creating her own cosmic light, which you'll see as we move forward into the coloring stage. That, as I've done with a few of the previous pieces, she's combining sort of the cosmic and the earthy in a very condensed fashion, both in terms of composition and in terms of the characters that I'm developing. There's a lot that I did to bring the flowers together, so that they feel like they're kind of moving as a mass. Are they sort of vibrating under gravity or under some magical force, or are they sort of pushing against each other through a wind that's passing through them? At first, they were very separate from each other, almost like chess pieces, and I wanted to cut that back a little bit, make it a bit more integrated. So in addition to that, I'm figuring out sort of thatching and diagonal density. You can see the grass that I put underneath the figure's right hand, as well as the hair as it is waving up and down, making that sense of both three-dimensionality looking down and into the picture, but also just really dense patterning, so that it catches the attention a bit more and also gives the effect of greater realism and energy. So at this point, there was a lot of refinement of the greenery, figuring out what I wanted to do with the flowers. What are things going to look like? How are they going to be colored? I put that little upside down cross, kind of playing at that upside down cross on her lapel, that if she were standing right up, it would just be a cross itself. So it is both sort of a Christian affirmative and a Christian negative, depending on the perspective that she's in. Within this case, she's witchy, so she exists outside of Christendom. So definitely bringing in that particular historical tradition, but going a bit farther with all the other more whimsical associations. So that's the pencil work. Now I'm going into the fine line work to define everything and to throw in colors on top of that. So much of this was just freehand, but I did use some streamlining in order to get really clean lines. It took a while to do because there was so much detail, as you can see. It's developing here. But it really does pay off, getting those graphite preliminary drawings down so that you can figure out how things really overlay and the lines are optimized. They're not just clean lines, but they are effective lines. So at this point, a lot of coloring. I threw in kind of a dusky pink as a base and then started doing body coloring over that. So you see the entirety of the body is sort of done in a brick red at this point. I distinguished that pretty radically from the foliage, which is this sort of luminescent purple blue, very sort of stellar looking, and using that as a driving contrast. Often when I'm thinking of colors, I'm thinking, what immediately do they symbolize, and how do I compose using what they symbolize? So at this point, laying in some additional sort of depths of color, putting that blue in over the surrounding foliage, getting some of that reflected blue into the figure herself, making sure that brick red is remaining as far as necessary as a kind of earthy foundation, but then creating that stellar effect on top of and beyond it. So at this point, using the color not just to identify things symbolically, but a certain amount of rendering. Right? You can see how I've defined the jaw against the neck. I'm working the hair against the foliage. Her clothing is sort of reflected on by the foliage sitting back. I threw a big sort of blue overlay over the whole thing. And then I'm working with some highlighting effects. As you can see, I wanted to get that sense of electricity. So one of the great things about digital painting is that you can get those kinds of photographic effects quite readily in a way that can take quite a while to build up through traditional means, watercolor, oil, or pencil. Create that luminosity, which is built into the algorithm of these brushes. So I'm doing that around her temples, doing that underneath the flower that you see there, kind of setting a template for what I might want to do with the rest of the picture, but beginning with all of those as a functional start. So from there, you can see that I've identified all these other areas where I want to have that electrification bleeding through the foliage up and out into the atmosphere. and creating that strong contrast to the kind of nighttime mood that I'm creating with the overall. Bringing some of that white and blue into the highlights of her hair, really figuring out how far I want to render this, and really what is the final color character of this entire scene. Is it a red, blue, white scene? Is it, red, blue, white with strong and representative orange accents? I've left the palette sort of narrow enough that I can really focus in on the colors as a character in the entirety of the picture. Also, she's a witch, so the color of her skin is kind of all over the place. It can be, anything that I choose it to be. Decided to make it kind of a corpse coloring here. It's really blued out. She might have, pale white skin. She might be very, very, very pale blue. Sort of depends on how the overall atmosphere integrates with all of that. So at this point, I'm also figuring out how the highlights within the foliage are going to interact with the foliage itself, which still looks a little preliminary. You can see the pencil lines. I sort of left them in there to get a better sense of detail and how things overlap. I'm also bringing in, at this point, I decided that the color character had to change. I brought in some green in order to set things back. I found the blue was perhaps a little too much of a default, right? Sort of the deep blue night. So bringing in some green in order to complicate it a bit. It's the time of night or the time of dusk or even dawn is quite unclear when you make it a matter of green shadows versus blue and purple shadows. So building it out from there, finding some of the edges of these flowers and leaves, the foliage that I'm talking about, finding the edges of her features. You can see that I've illuminated that little sort of solar system almost that is on her right shoulder. Each one of those is projecting light. So what that helps to do is make this very fantastical. It helps to make it very much an allegorical figure rather than a realistic one, even though I'm doing some sort of realistic rendering. Nobody has light shining out of their shoulder in that way. She's become sort of a cosmic being. So finding the interaction between the light in the ground and the light that's being cast by some sky, whatever sort of moonlight looks like here, was a big balance that's occurring at this point. So how am I creating that underlighting, that sort of reflected light, those reflected shadows, those deep shadow accents in order to pull things forward and to integrate them? What else am I doing here? So bring in some highlights along with the dark accents to divide different parts of the figure and the other parts of the characterization from each other. So you have the sort of dark red end points of her hair, as well as the sort of dark blue, sort of grayed out lines of the jaws, etc. And figuring out, what the sort of secondary lighting is going to look like on the ground. So you can see that the electrification is this kind of pale blue-green, but then you have a little bit of orange, a little bit of purple that exists around the flowers as well. And there's another color shift. So what I said is still relevant, I think. I pumped that up a little bit so that you get a sense of light passing through the flowers, the grass, that kind of foliage, and really heightening the effect of the witch, bringing up those pinks, purples, and lighting it. One of the final touches that I did, which, frankly, I don't know if it was a great decision, but I've left it this way, is I created an equation between the eyes and the mouth. You can see that they're all sort of dark strips. So like I was talking about creating an allegorical effect using allegorical supernatural effect by creating that kind of solar system on her shoulder, I didn't want the mouth and the eyes to be that realistic. I wanted the way in which she's sort of receding back into her brain or into her spirit or engaging in this electrification of the earth to really not quite look like a natural activity that we would recognize as human beings. So whether or not that worked well, I think totally up for grabs. But that's it. That's the final on that image. I enjoyed this one. It was one of the longer and more developed Procreate paintings that I've made. And, As always, thank you for watching. If you have any comments or any questions about the technique here, if you have any thoughts about some of the ideas that I presented, please engage me. I'm happy to discuss those things. You can subscribe. You can find me at Miles Lewis Art on Instagram. MilesLewisStudio.com is my site, and I'll see you next time.